bring in Roman Waschuk, former Canadian ambassador to Ukraine and business ombudsman, the Business Ombudsman Council. Thank you very much for helping us this afternoon take a look at the situation. So NATO leaders will be meeting tomorrow. I think you heard a little bit about what our previous guest was talking about. One of the things she said is, does humanitarianism stop at NATO borders? I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, Hannah's a friend that I know from her time as a parliamentarian in Kiev, and I can certainly empathize with her feelings on this, and especially as someone who, over nearly 30 years in Canadian diplomacy, worked on all sorts of NATO out-of-area deployments. Afghanistan, obviously, after 9/11, but even before that, intervention in the Balkan Wars. I was part of the Kosovo task force. And so this idea that, if you're even a centimeter outside NATO borders, NATO couldn't possibly do a thing, is actually anathema to everything the alliance has been doing for the last 30 years. Now, there are obviously reasons for that. There are realpolitik reasons, but they may well also be part of our failure to understand what actually deters Vladimir Putin.
And obviously sanctions aren't doing that. I mean, it may be hurting Russia, but it's not deterring him from the war in Ukraine. With this meeting tomorrow with NATO, what are you going to be watching for? Are we expecting any big announcements, or is that even possible at this point? Is it more just about talking next steps?
It's probably about demonstrating continued unity. So that's a reason why there probably won't be any big new steps, because there isn't unity about those. What I'd hope not to see in here are these constant clarifications about what NATO or individual allies will not be doing. There's this, I think, illusion that this somehow reassures the Russians that we won't intervene, we won't react, we won't be provoked into doing anything. I think a bit more strategic ambiguity would be helpful in this respect. There is, I think, a turning point happening on the ground in Ukraine. Their Russian forces northwest of Kyiv look like they're in big trouble. The Ukrainians look like they're cutting off their supply lines. And so Hannah was making this point that something that seemed inconceivable a month ago, which is a Ukrainian victory, at least on the ground, is now something we need to be looking at and understanding for ourselves how to help them do it and how that helps our own strategic position.
It's interesting that you should say that, you don't want to hear NATO telegraph what it won't do, what its members will not do. So in case that emboldens Putin. But at the same time, there are many that believe because this war has not been won, because he, as Prime Minister Trudeau just said, miscalculated, that he will raise the stakes and potentially use chemical or nuclear warfare.
So therefore, we let him raise the stakes and fold. Is that the logical consequence?
Can Ukraine win this?
On the ground, it is turning it around. So unless our goal is to bury Ukraine with as many well-intentioned press releases and empathetic sounding phrases as possible, no, we got to help them win this one, because that keeps Putin away from the sacred NATO borders. Ukraine losing means that an emboldened Putin is right there at the border.
As former ambassador, I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on NATO. There's been criticism over the years that it hadn't changed, that it was outdated, that but there is much more unity. It's been on top of this in terms of its allies and the call for solidarity. Has NATO been reworked or reborn through this?
It has, to a large extent. I think the belief that it was outdated or pointless was based on a misreading of Russia and what its intentions were. Ever since the early 2000s, after the first year or two of Putin's rule, he has been aiming for reassertion of strategic dominance in Central and Eastern Europe. And you can see the diplomatic proposals, or so-called diplomatic proposals, the Russians sent in December meant they wanted to roll back NATO to 1997 boundaries. So again, this has been about more than Ukraine from the start. And to pretend that if we just close our eyes, Putin and his ambitions will go away is naive in the extreme.
Naive in the extreme. Roman Waschuk, former Canadian ambassador to Ukraine. I really appreciate you coming on the program this afternoon. Thanks for your time.
You're very welcome.